Thank you for letting me share my story. This took me a while to sit and write, as it happened over 3 years ago. The pain from it is still fresh. I would like to remain as anonymous as possible, so I'll tell you my name is Rachel. I live in Alabama for this story, and I feel safer using this information as I still haven't told my family what really happened. I wrote on an FB ad. This is how it started. It was an ad about a sugar-free marinade sauce. I'm a diabetic and often write in groups and on ads that I guess FB tailors to me. There were a bunch of comments on the ad. I simply said I had tried the sauce and I found it delicious, and it kept my blood sugar at a good level. I didn't think too much about it, but a man named Richard replied to my comment and said he liked my response and asked if he could send me a private message. I replied to him and said, yes, go ahead. I thought maybe he had a question about the sauce. I have in the past received messages from other diabetics who wanted to know about something. In fact, I help in a diabetic medical group online, so to me it just seemed normal to accept a private message. Richard said he was glad that I enjoyed the sauce, and he thought my comment was very smart. I asked him if he had tried it, and he told me no, but he would consider it. He said my profile picture was cute. I thanked him and asked if he was watching his blood sugar as well. He told me that he was a widow and he had a young son named Nicholas, and he said that his son was diabetic and often very sick. He asked if I had kids, which I didn't. I had been unmarried and not dating anyone during this time of my life. Richard said he was 50 years old and his son was 11. He told me his son was diabetic and he was doing the best he could to raise him alone. I told Richard that I too was diabetic, and when I started asking him some medical questions about his son, he said it pained him to discuss it, but thanked me for caring about him. I left it alone, as some people are not comfortable talking about their medical issues, let alone one of their child. Richard asked me if I was married. I told him no, and he said he lived in New York, but often worked abroad, and his son was with a nanny when he had to leave the country. I told him it must be hard on his son to deal with his medical issue and be alone for periods of time with a nanny. Richard told me that he worked for a contractor building roads and bridges in underdeveloped countries. He said he had just gotten back from Ghana, where he had helped build interstate roads. He said the company he worked for was contracted through the government. We started a friendly chat. He asked me about my job, and I only told him that I worked in public service. I wasn't really open with him, as I don't tend to tell people I just met online too much of my personal life. He asked me for my phone number, and I told him no because I don't know him well enough. He said he's not always on the site due to work and asked if we could just keep in touch. I told him to feel free to message me anytime. He then asked for my email address, and I ended up giving him that. It felt safer than my phone number at this point. We parted ways on chat, and I received an email from him a few hours later introducing himself, stating that he loved to cook romantic dinners, about where he lived, his cars, his son, and he sent me a couple of pictures of his son. He told me his son is often sick and how he felt like a failure because he can't cure his son. He asked about me, my likes, my history, and again if I was single. I emailed him back a few lines just telling him I was single again, my likes, but I kept things friendly and kind of not too personal. I treated it as if I was talking to a stranger I met in a store. Nothing extremely personal about myself. Richard would reply to me almost right away. It was like he was waiting for my email. He told me he enjoyed reading my words and emailed me back asking me some more questions. Where do I see myself in a year? What are my favorite foods to cook? Have I ever traveled out of the country? And he asked about where I live. He ended his email saying, if I had any questions for him, please ask. I actually chose to ask him how he balances keeping his son happy food-wise when dealing with him being diabetic, and how long does he stay out of the country on his work duties. I had shared with him that I had never left the United States on vacation, and I hadn't. I live a pretty boring and simple life. I work days, spend my evenings online in diabetic support groups, and try to maintain my health. I wasn't sure what all he wanted to know, or if he was expecting some dramatic and exciting life, because that's definitely not my thing. Richard wrote back shortly after I responded. He said his nanny prepares all of the food for his son, and that she is also a nurse and a nanny, so he doesn't have to worry that his son's needs are not met. Richard said he stays away sometimes for months, but that most of his contracts are for 5 weeks at a time, sometimes longer, if the construction project has delays. He sent me a few photos of the project and said he had just worked on these and he will be going back to Ghana to finish up a bridge project for the government there. Richard told me he was born to Norwegian parents and went to a private school in Poland, then came to the USA after graduation and has been in the United States ever since. He said that when he lost his wife, it was the hardest time for him and his son. Since then, he's been searching for his better half, someone who would understand his son's complex medical issues. I responded with a very caring email and explained my medical situation and that you can live a great life, and his son would be fine as long as he maintains his doctor's advice, keeps getting healthy meals, and stays active. Richard told me he could tell I was loving and caring, and he felt a special connection to me. He asked again for my phone number. I replied and asked him for his number instead, and said when I feel more comfortable, I'll share mine, but I'm more comfortable just emailing. He replied with, "Okay, dear," but he never gave me his number. I went about my days and would check email a few times a week, but I didn't hear from Richard for over a week. He finally replied telling me he'd been very busy with his big contract and he would be leaving for Ghana in a week to finish building a bridge and road for the government. I replied that I wished him a good trip. Richard once more asked for my number so we could keep in touch, as he would not be online hardly at all, and he said his son had not felt well and he would like to keep in touch with me for support. I ended up giving him my number and asked for his and hoped that his son was going to do better. Richard ended up calling me. His number was a Los Angeles area code. I didn't pick it up at first because I didn't know the number and there was no name on the caller ID. He said it was Richard though and wanted to say hello and wanted to leave me his number, which he left in a voicemail. We then started a voice chat over the phone. I have to say during the time I knew him, he always called me directly. He never asked me to download any type of calling app. Looking back, yes, he did have an accent, but it wasn't strong. There was a slight mispronouncement of some words, but there was only a few words he said which were not very clear. The first time on the phone we spoke for about an hour. He told me about his son and how hard it is to get medication for him. I found that very odd because him being in the United States and a child, access to diabetic medication shouldn't be too much of a problem. I gave him the name of some organizations that might be able to help, and Richard was quite polite. He was never rude to me. He talked a lot about his upcoming trip to Ghana and how he would love to bring his son, but there was no medicine there if he became sick. I understood and told him part of the reason I don't travel out of the country was due to my health. I've had some cardiovascular issues and I like to stay close to home. It's a safety net for me. Richard said he would love to visit me sometime after his contract. I told him that I've never met anyone from online before. He had asked if I dated online before and I told him no. I told him we'll see how things go from here, and then that's when our online relationship kind of started. Richard and I talked nearly every day. Even when he left for his trip, he always called me direct. He sent me a photo of his building project and talked about his son daily. He did give me an email address to the nanny who watched his son and encouraged me to email once in a while and ask how he's doing. He said he told his son about me, to which I felt that was way too soon. It put me in a hard spot, and Richard said his son was asking about me. He gave me the email to his son and wanted me to email him and say hello. It was a weird position to be put into because while I did have feelings for Richard, I didn't feel comfortable emailing his child. I did eventually email his son just to say hello and that I was his father's friend, after Richard kept pressuring me. Richard's project was taking a while, and he said his son was going to be on vacation from school and that his nanny had to leave for a family emergency, so he was flying his son to Ghana to be with him for about 3 weeks, and then they would fly home to the States and meet me. We really had a special connection, or so I thought. He would always do his best to check on me and called me right after my cardiologist appointment to ask how I was doing. He kept trying to pressure me to fly out to Ghana to visit him, and I told him I don't have a passport, and I don't feel comfortable due to my health, but I did agree to meet him and his son when he returned from his trip. I was a little apprehensive about the young son flying halfway around the world, but he said he was flying his son first class. He was worried about his son that he wouldn't have enough medication, but I advised him on how to make the nanny pack everything up. He said the nanny would pack everything to ensure things would be fine. He was flying his son, as he said, first class, and not to worry. I emailed his son wishing him a good flight and told him to do what the airline people tell him and he would be just fine. Richard called me when his son arrived and said he was safe and fine. We talked about meeting, and I did hear his son say hello in the background when he called me a few times. He was staying with Richard at a very nice hotel, or so he said. We kept talking and planning our meet once he returned home. About a week into his son being there, Richard told me he loved me and knew I would be a great mother to his son. While things were going well, I was still a bit scared to meet his son and be that involved. I had told Richard it's too soon to be a mother to his son, but Richard said his son asked about me and felt connected to me due to us both being diabetic. While I felt sympathy for his son and knowing what it's like to grow up with this disease, I still wanted to take our time with knowing his son and his son knowing me on a personal level. Richard said things were going well, but the work was slow moving. He often talked about how the workers were not working fast enough and the materials were hard to get to the job site on time, and he would be delayed by weeks. We kept in touch daily, and his son would email me every few days too, saying he was bored at the hotel, but that he wasn't feeling good either. One afternoon, Richard called me crying. He said his son ran out of medication due to being delayed at work, and some of the workers told him not to worry, there's a clinic where his son could get medication. But upon arrival at the clinic, they didn't have his medicine. I was greatly concerned, and Richard said his son was very weak and falling asleep a lot. I urged him to test his blood sugar and get him to a bigger city for some help. Richard told me he would, and then I didn't hear from him for about 2 days. I was worried sick. Richard called me and told me that he got his son to a bigger town and that he was at a medical center, but the doctor said his son needs special medication and would have to import it by an emergency flight, and it would be $7,000 for the flight, medication, and treatment. Richard said his bank card was not working, and likely because he had to report his card compromised, as he said one of the workers had taken a photo of his card when he was at the local shop buying the worker's food and water, and he thinks the worker might have gotten his card number, so he put a fraud warning on his account. Richard was crying, saying his son's unwell. He needed medical attention right away and his medication. He begged me to bank transfer $7,000 to the hospital accounting department so they could facilitate the medication. I told Richard I don't have $7,000 and told him to contact the embassy for assistance to airlift his son to the United States. They could also possibly stabilize him. Richard told me there would be no time to make such arrangements and that the embassy was closed until Monday, and this was a Friday. He screamed that his son is very unwell and screamed for me to come up with the money. He said he tried to raise some money and would likely come up with $2,000, but then would need the other $5,000. He said he would pay me back triple the money just to help his son. I didn't know what to do. I had credit cards I could borrow on, and I stupidly did that. I took 2 loans out against my cards, transferred the money into my bank, and then asked him who to send the money to. Richard gave me the name of a man in the hospital in Ghana who would secure the medication and the flight to bring the medication in as soon as he got the money. Richard said he already gave him the $2,000, he just needed the $5,000 from me. Richard said he sold his grandfather's watch and his deceased wife and his wedding rings that he always kept with him. He was crying and heartbroken. He begged me, and I felt so bad for him and his sick son that I wired the money. The interest rate on the loan was over 28%. I told him it would have to be paid back right away and explained the interest rate. Richard said as soon as he returns home, he would pay me triple. I told him, just pay me back the money you owe and any interest I had to pay. I took a photo of the transfer information and texted it to Richard. He told me he would let me know how his son is, and I waited. A day later, Richard told me his son was doing better and I saved his life. Richard asked if I'd marry him. I was so caught up on the caring about his son and knowing I helped save his life that I told him yes, I would. I was so wrapped up in the health of his son and the connection we had with that, I felt like he was a part of my family and that they both were parts of my family. Richard told me he would come home soon, and he was trying to find someone to cover the end of the project so him and his son could be flown home. I told him I'd be here and I couldn't wait to see them both. Meanwhile, my own health had taken a turn. I think mostly due to all the stress of everything, and I was now worried about getting my money back. I couldn't afford the monthly payments on the loans without it impacting my own health and my own medication needs. Richard spoke less and less to me, and I figured he was busy trying to get things taken care of with his building project, dealing with his son, so I didn't worry too much. However, more than a week went by without so much as a phone call or email from Richard. I would call and he wouldn't answer. Finally, I sent an email asking what was going on, that I'd been worried sick about him and his son, and then brought up the first loan payment would be due soon. Richard called me, telling me he's very busy with his building project and the government has been pushing him to finish or face fines. I asked how his son is doing, and he said he's fine, and that I need to stop pressuring him with questions. He went from being very romantic to being cold and callous. He told me to just wait, and he'll be home soon. I brought up the loan, and he told me that I don't understand his struggles, and to stop being so demanding. We had our first and last argument. I told him that the money had to be repaid, and while I realized he's under a lot of stress, that I also was under stress as I was taking some of my medication budget money and putting it towards my loan payments. Richard told me not to stress, all would be okay. It was 2 more weeks before I heard from him again. I called all the time and emailed with no reply. I ended up making the loan payments, and I let him know I was struggling with paying for my own medication now because of him. Richard emailed me back telling me to stop disturbing him, and that he would be home in a week and get my money since it's all I seem to care about. He told me he was breaking off the engagement and that his son didn't want to speak to me anymore because I was stressing his father. I told Richard that I've done nothing wrong other than ask for my money back. I called him to try and work and talk through this, but he wouldn't answer. The next time I called, the number was no longer in service. I emailed several times with no response. At this point, I was in a panic, and I wrote him another email telling him how bad off I would be if he didn't respond to my email and pay the loans, but I received no response. My mind had started to panic, thinking maybe something happened to his son, maybe something happened to him. I reached out to an embassy in Ghana and was able to speak to someone about the building project location and situation. The woman I spoke to urged me to call the police in my country, as she informed me that even if there was a sick child, especially someone visiting from America, that they wouldn't need to pay thousands upon thousands for medication, and she felt that I might have been scammed. I called the police locally and filed a report. The police told me never to send money to someone I don't know, and told me there's very little they could do, but they felt that I'd been the victim of online fraud. I continued to email Richard with no reply. I even kept trying the number, which said not in service. A few weeks later, I called the number, and it prompted me to a voicemail app. I left several voicemails with no response. I gave the information to the police of who I wired the money to via bank transfer. I also let my bank know, but they couldn't do anything but file a fraud alert. They alerted the bank in Ghana as well and then gave them my contact information. I never heard anything back from anyone in Ghana, the bank, police, nobody. I was left financially destroyed, medically in trouble, and it took me over a year to pay back the loans. I had to reach out to family for some money to help with my medication. I never told them why I couldn't afford it, only that the price had changed with my insurance and I needed a little help. I am still ashamed and haven't told them to this day what happened, but I wanted to share with everyone here what happened to me. I know the mistakes I made, and looking back, I was following my heart and my love for who I thought was a sick boy. In reality, I probably bought some young scammer some new designer clothes and God knows what else. We'd like to thank this lady for sharing her story. This is a situation where the scammer played on her heartstrings by trying to angle that of a sick child with a common medical condition with the target victim. Remember, if you find yourself in a situation like this where someone is telling you that they're in a foreign country needing medical help, instead of sending money, give them the contact information to the embassy and tell them you'll call the embassy for them as well. Most times scammers will block you and move on to another target victim. No matter what the person tells you, do not send money, bank transfers, or gift cards. Offer to help by giving contact information to the authorities. Most times the scammer behind this story won't put up any more effort into getting cash from you. They'll assume you're seeing the red flags and move on. If you've encountered an online romance scammer and you'd like to share your story, you can find us scammingscammers@gmail.com. Drop us an email. If you have any screenshots or information on the chat you had with the person, feel free to share those as well. You can stay as anonymous as you'd like. Until next time, stay safe and don't send money or gift cards or transfer money via bank to someone you don't know.